first, welcome everyone. So far we have 27 participants. Thank you all for being here to our fourth North American Millets Alliance webinar. That's about what we've been averaging, around 30, and that's really terrific. Today's topic, even more interesting than they have been. Why are millets ideal for a warming climate? And we have two presenters today. Juan DeSalvo, who's a graduate student in plant breeding at Iowa State University, has been working on millets for his research. There was a little overview of each speaker sent available. I hope I'm not going to read it back to you, but welcome to Juan. And then Dr. Daniel Packer, who is a research associate in Sustainable Foods Seed Systems Laboratory at Washington State University, who has also done extensive research on millets, quinoa, sorghum as well. And we're really happy that both speakers have been able to join us and make the time to be here. We'll have anywhere from, I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes of presentations by each, and then hopefully have some time for some Q&A afterwards, but we might as well get started. Thank you again for being here. And here we go. I think Juan will be first, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Let me share my screen. So, do you see?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, as Sean says, my name is Juan DeSalvo. I'm a graduate student at Iowa State University. I'm in plant breeding department working with Dr. Danny Singh. And today I will present some of the field trials that we did last year and some of the future projects that we will be doing this year. And although the title of my presentation is about millet characterization for Iowa growing conditions, I would like to briefly start talking a little bit about soybeans. And that's because I'm originally from Argentina, and soybeans is the main crop there. And Argentina is the third producer of soybeans in the world. And until the late 70s, soybeans were totally unknown in my country. So we went from 0 bushels per acre in the 70s to more than 38 million tons actually. And this was possible because the interaction between farmers, producers, researchers, policymakers, and all these different actors in the system. So the reason why I'm saying this is because I feel like with millets could be something similar that we are achieving here in NAMA, people from different backgrounds, different activities working together to develop these amazing crops. So initially, I want to show this picture. This is the millet worldwide production. And as you can see, let me see if I can put my pointer. Yeah, I think, yeah, there. So you can see that most of the green points, it's where the production areas are. And this is semi-arid regions across Africa, Central Africa, Asia, China. And there's some here in the US. Millets are mostly grown in semi-arid regions of the world, and it's one of the staple foods for these populations. So people really depend on millet production in these semi-arid regions. So the reason why we are interested in producing millets here in Iowa, that would be a good question that I asked myself at the beginning of my master's here in Iowa State. So as you could see in the previous image, I was showing that millets are very well adapted to semi-arid regions. Why it's not changing. Okay, so it's very popular in these parts of the world, and people depend on this cereal for consumption. It is also a very adaptable crop to different harsh environmental conditions. Millets adapt to very drought heat, poor nutrient soils. So it's a very resilient crop. And in future climate change scenarios where we have more erratic weather conditions, more drought or more flooding, this could be a good trade, a must-trade hub for crops in the future. The other point that it's important, it's a market. Although in the US, we feel that there's no still solid market for this type of crops. There are several countries in the world where the demand is higher than the production, and we feel that exports from the US to these countries could be one item to consider. But also, it's the part of the neglected crop. There's not much research conducted on millets, and we are working on that, and we hope to have more information soon to share with all of you. So what we did in Iowa last year, we started with a millet characterization. So we request the whole finger millet, barnyard millet, and foxtail millet collection from Green USDA. And we planted an unreplicated trial here in Boone, Iowa. As you can see in the image, those were the plots, 4 rows, 5 feet long, spaced 15 inches. So that's the total amount of each of the 3 species that we planted. In total, were around 1,500 plots. And what we did with Danny, my advisor, we walked the plots and we visually selected the most suitable plots that we saw because of the growing conditions. There were some that didn't emerge, some that didn't flower in time, some that had some issues. So we walk and we select some of them. And then at the end of the season, we go to those selections that we did and we collect more traits, because it's like a time-sensitive thing. We cannot make a lot of measurements if in 1,500 plots we have a lot of other research going on. So we prioritize those, and we went at the end of the season and we collect more information at the very end, like plant height, panicle shape, lodging, and I will show you later on some of them. For foxtail millets, although we planted the crop and we made some selections, I won't be presenting results on that crop, especially because we found very hard to manage Setaria. It's related to a very common set of weeds here in Iowa, and management practices were complicated. So I will be presenting results just for finger and barnyard today. So as I was saying, at the end of the season, we went and collect information on the selected plots for finger millets. We selected 61 plots out of the 700. This is approximately 9% of them. And we take plant height measurements. Leafiness was a very, it's called subjective and visual rating, where we take into account tillering, leaf width, leaf length, and number of leaves. Head compactness, seed coloration, and 1,000 seed weight. Those were collected, of course, after harvest. As you can see, inflorescence shape, we have very different types, and this is very important with us if we are planning and doing plant breeding on this crop. It's very important to select inflorescence that we can use for crossing. So as you can see in the very right, it's the fist type, and that's a problem for us if we try to perform crosses, because at its closed and compact, it's hard to emasculate and to make contact between the 2 different inflorescences. And then seed coloration, you can see also variability between brown, light brown, brown, and copper brown. So this table shows a summary of what we observed for finger millets. For seed coloration, we can see that there's a big amount of brown color compared to the other coloration of the seed. Inflorescence, we have wide different types of inflorescence, leafiness, and then lot chain susceptibility. What is important for us here is that there is variability. We found a lot of variability in the 61 that we selected, and that's important moving forward in the breeding program. I want also to show you some of the traits that are more quantitative traits, like average plant height and 1,000 seed weight. You can see that for plant height, it ranged between 1 meter and around 40 centimeters. So there were very short plants, very tall plants, everything in between. And for 1,000 seed weights, we have very heavy, I mean, talking for millets, it's a kind of heavy seed compared to a more lighter seed. When we move to barnyard millet, we collect less amount of traits in this crop. And we got plant height, leafiness. We took the data, there was not much variability there, and 1,000 seed weights. So for this, for barnyard, we collect only 18 out of the 200 that we have. And overall, the average plant height for barnyard millet was higher. Well, we can see here that it's higher, although we have some lower accessions that reach around 75 centimeters. And for seed weight, again, between 2.9 grams per 1,000 seed and 1.97 or so, but we still observe some variability. So we are very excited about this. I will show you as some conclusions that we got from last year. It's, as I was saying, we have great variability of finger and barnyard in the collection that we observed. And we are moving forward and we need to collect more information, more in detail. Last year was a very preliminary characterization. We need to get yield estimates, maturity notes, yield components. In fact, we need to do replicated trials. So there's a lot of work to do. And this characterization that we did and what we will keep doing will help us to identify the most suitable candidates for parental crossing and developing new varieties. As future work, some of the things that I was saying before, this year we have replicated trials at 2 locations, and it would be for barnyard millet and finger millet, yes. We will do a more robust characterization of the germplasm, as I was saying before. We'll get more phenological descriptions, more inside data, more in-season data, and end of season. We will also think in characterizing for nutrient content, for protein, calcium. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And finally, we will also start this year with a characterization of proso millet collection. We are going to plant 700 plots and replicate it again for the first year and do similar characterization as we did previous year. As a final note, I would like, we still don't have the date, but we are planning doing field demo day here in Ames, Iowa, where we'll be showing the different species of finger millets that we have in the field. We are attempting to do this early in September this year, but as soon as we will have more information, I will make contact with you guys, and probably I hope some of you can come here to Ames. So thank you, and if you have any questions now or later, there's my email. You can send me an email or ask me now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. was great. And then Sophia, are we ready to move on to Dr. Packer, or do we need to do anything on the tech back end there?
Dr. K
Okay,
will play the video.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnaswamy.
No problem. Thank you everyone for joining us. Can you see the screen and hear the volume?
Yes.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Daniel Packer. I'm super happy to be here to be able to talk sorghum with you all. It's been a long time since I've had a conversation about sorghum with anybody. I've been a quinoa breeder at Washington State University for most of the last 7 years. But prior to that, I was a sorghum breeder for a company called Cirrus Incorporated. And then I did my plant breeding PhD focused on sorghum breeding and genetics at Texas A&M University with Dr. Bill Rooney. One thing I will say about my sorghum background is that I think that most of you all are interested in sorghum as a grain and a seed crop. I did both my work at Texas A&M and my work at Cirrus Incorporated on biomass sorghums, which biomass sorghums are sorghums that are managed to maximize the production of structural carbohydrates, things like lignin, cellulose, to go into biofuel applications. And at latitudes in North America, they produce either no seed or very little seed. And so there is that caveat with my sorghum background. That being said, there's a lot of similarities between biomass sorghums and grain sorghums, and I am super pleased to be here to introduce you to sorghum and to give you a few ideas on how to use sorghum. So for those of y'all who maybe are just learning about sorghum for the first time, it is a C4 grass. Being that it is a C4, it already has an inherent advantage, making it more photosynthetically efficient in high temperature or drought stress environments versus a C3 plant like you might find in rice or in wheat. Other C4 grasses that you might be familiar with include maize and sugarcane. Maize and sugarcane are moderately closely related to sorghum. There have been hybrids made between sugarcane and sorghum. Sorghum is mostly a self-pollinated crop, but in the United States and also in other high production environments, the industry is based on hybrid cultivars in the same way that the corn industry in the United States is based on hybrid cultivars. It's generally managed as an annual, but it is weekly perennial. In regions with a long enough growing season, a ratoon crop is possible. A ratoon crop is simply a second crop off of one planting. So for example, in deep South Texas, sorghum grower, if there is sufficient water and fertilizer available, is sometimes able to pull a second grain crop off of their first grain crop. And so sorghum does have that advantage in some environments. Sorghum was domesticated about 5,000 years ago in northeastern Africa, in what we now call Sudan. And after domestication, it pretty quickly went east into the Indian subcontinent and west into West Africa along both trade and migration routes. And then after it spread into these two areas, it also went down into Southern Africa via a eastern route and via a western route. And each time it was introduced into a new environment, farmers selected it both for their own end uses and also for local adaptation. But also sorghum outcrossed readily with already established wild sorghums. And these wild sorghums served as a source of local adaptation that produced quite a bit of diversity in sorghum. And that diversity, we can see it in the 5 different racial categories that are generally used to group sorghum. Now, these are not clean racial categories. There's a lot of intermediates between them, and there's a lot of specialty types within the different racial categories. But it is helpful to think about sorghum this way. Each one of these racial categories has its own adaptation and specific end uses that it generally is used for. Let me adjust my camera here so I can see the whole slide. So for example, Dura sorghums, they typically are grown in really dry parts of India and also along the Horn of Africa, and they tend to be adapted to drought environments. That's kind of their niche, what they're known for. But on the other hand, Guinea sorghums are grown mostly in Western Africa, and they're adapted to high rainfall environments. And you can kind of see that in their panicle architecture. They have an open panicle that is going to be less susceptible to both pre-harvest sprouting and to grain mold. Caudatums and Kafirs are very important in the United States most sorghum germplasm in the United States is going to be either a caudatum or a Kaffir. So that diversity can also be seen in the different end uses that sorghum can be managed for. So this is something that's fairly unique for sorghum. You don't see this in a lot of other crops. But for example, you have sorghum types that can be managed to maximize their grain production. You also have sorghums like this one right here in the upper right corner. This is a sweet sorghum. So this is a sorghum that accumulates sugar in its stem, in the same way that sugarcane accumulates sugar in its stem, and in the same way as sugarcane, it can be processed to harvest sugar. Down here in the bottom right corner, we have what is globally probably one of the more important applications of sorghum, and that is as a forage crop. These are sorghums that can be managed to be used as silage, as hay, or to be grazed directly by animals. And then here to this last picture, this is biomass sorghum, which is what I worked with in the past. These can be used, like I said, for biofuels, for building materials, or anywhere where you just need just a lot of biomass, as the name implies. So in terms of sorghum production globally, for grain, it is the 5th most produced grain crop, right between just below barley and right above oats. And then in terms of where it's produced, it generally is produced in the semi-arid tropics. So for example, if you look at this chart right here, these are the top 5 countries in terms of area planted, not in production, but just area planted. And you can see that except for the United States, which is the 5th most here on the chart, all these countries are in the semi-arid tropics. So countries like Sudan, Nigeria, India, and Niger lead the world in amount of area planted to sorghum. In terms of sorghum yields, global sorghum yields tend to be very low, or pretty low. And that is because sorghum is generally planted in environments where they're going to get heat and drought stress. So they tend to be in low productivity environments. So globally, sorghum yields about 1.5 metric tons per hectare. In the United States, the yield is quite a bit higher at 4.3 metric tons per hectare, but still it is quite a bit lower than what is seen in the United States for maize, which is almost double, or more than double actually, of what is seen in sorghum yields in the United States. Now, given the right environment, sorghum does have a pretty tremendous yield potential. So for example, here last year in the United States, in 2022, the record yield for irrigated sorghum was 15.4 metric tons per hectare. So given the right conditions, sorghum does have a substantial yield potential. In terms of where sorghum is produced in the United States, like I mentioned, it tends to be concentrated in environments that are susceptible to heat and drought stress. And we can see this here. This is a map of sorghum production by county. Most of it is in the high plains, western Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, eastern Colorado. There is an important sorghum production region down here along the coastal bend in Texas. It doesn't show up here on this map, but there generally is usually some sorghum production in the Mississippi River Delta, here along the border between Arkansas and Mississippi. And sorghum tends to be concentrated in these areas because sorghum is a well-known crop for producing grain in drought-stressed environments. And this tends to be because sorghum, let me minimize my camera again so that I can see this chart and walk you through it. Sorghum is able to initiate yield when there's less water available versus many other crops. So in this chart, here on this bottom axis, we have evapotranspiration. We can basically think of evapotranspiration as the amount of water that is being consumed by the crop. So we have sunflower, soybean, winter wheat, corn, and grain sorghum. And you can see that grain sorghum begins to initiate its yield at about 200 millimeters, while corn requires more water before it initiates yield at about 300 millimeters. And then the rate of increase in sorghum is higher at these lower water availabilities versus every other crop. Well, I guess corn is slightly higher, but still grain sorghum is outperforming corn, but definitely higher than what we see in, for example, in soybean or in winter wheat. And it's not until there is quite a bit of water available that corn begins to out-yield maize. I'm sorry, grain sorghum. And so it is in these water-limited environments where sorghum has the production environment. And this is in part due to the fact that sorghum is a deeply rooted crop. So sorghum is able to put down roots down to at least 2 meters in depth. And this is quite a bit deeper than what is seen in maize. I'm going to use maize and corn interchangeably. I'm sorry, but it's just going to happen that way. So sorghum, under conditions of no stress, like any crop, is going to be using water from the upper portion of the soil profile. But because of its deep rooting ability, under conditions of moderate to severe stress, it is going to move that water consumption, or where it's drawing its water from deeper in the soil profile. So in this case, it's drawing quite a bit of water from depths of up to 6 feet. So that provides sorghum with the ability to mine water that other crops cannot do. Another feature of sorghum drought tolerance is its ability to adjust its transpiration rate based on the vapor pressure deficit. Now, let me just briefly explain what a vapor pressure deficit is. The easiest way to think about it is that the vapor pressure deficit is the amount of water that the atmosphere is able to draw from a plant via transpiration. So a high vapor pressure deficit condition would, for example, be a hot, dry day with wind. That's going to draw a lot of plant out of a water via transpiration. So sorghum is able to detect those high vapor pressure deficit conditions and to be able to slow or reduce its transpiration rate, or the amount of water it is losing to the atmosphere. So for example, again, let me adjust my camera here. I know this is something that y'all can't see, but I need to be able to see this chart here. We have 3 different sorghum genotypes: SC803, SC982, and SC1345. Each one has a different approach to managing its transpiration rate in response to increasing vapor pressure deficit measures. So for example, SC803 as vapor pressure deficit increases, its transpiration rate increases up into a point, and then once it hits that break point, it's able to decrease its transpiration rate and slow its amount of water loss. SC982 doesn't reduce it, but it slows the rate at which transpiration grows in response to increasing vapor pressure deficits. And then this uppermost genotype just continues to increase its transpiration rate in response to high vapor pressure deficits. Now, one thing that's important to state with this trait in sorghum is that sorghum is able to do this independently of the amount of water that's in the soil. So even if there's plenty of water available in the soil and the plant could continue transpiring, sorghum genotypes that have these transpiration breakpoints are able to slow or reduce their transpiration rate, and this effectively saves water for later use. So for example, if early in the season sorghum experiences a high vapor pressure deficit, it could slow down its transpiration rate, leave that water in the soil, and have it available for later in the season, maybe at flowering, maybe during grain fill. And so this is a way to essentially sip water over the course of the season and save the water that it has available in the soil. And like I mentioned here at the bottom of the slide, it does vary by genotype. Not all sorghums are going to have this trait. Another trait that helps sorghum manage drought stress is epicuticular wax. A lot of plants will produce an epicuticular wax, but sorghum kind of takes this to the next level. And this is essentially a wax layer that accumulates on leaf tissues and on stems. And it does 2 things. One is it reflects incoming solar radiation, so it reduces the temperature of internal sorghum tissues. But another thing that it also does is it essentially seals water into sorghum tissues, water that would otherwise be lost to evaporation. Another trait that generally is not discussed with regards to drought adaptation in sorghum, but I actually think it is a drought tolerance trait, or it can be managed to be a drought tolerance trait, is the presence of photoperiod sensitivity and also different maturity options in sorghum hybrids. So photoperiod sensitivity is a feature in many landrace sorghums, especially landrace sorghums in Africa. And what this photoperiod sensitivity is a delay in when sorghum will initiate flowering and seed production until it receives a short day length signal. So it's going to vary by genotype, but this is going to be somewhere between 13 hours and 11 hours. And until sorghum detects that short day length, it is going to remain vegetative and will not initiate flowering until those day lengths are hit. Now, in a lot of traditional production regions where these land races are grown traditionally, that short day length typically will coincide with the end of the local rainy season. So this is an adaptation trait for these local land races to be able to more likely time their flowering and their grain filling stage at the end of the rainy season when they're going to be in well-watered soils. And then with regards to different options for hybrid maturities, this is a function for a lot of sorghums that are available in the United States and in high production environments. A grower is going to be able to select between early maturity, mid maturity, and late maturity hybrids. And they can select those different maturity hybrids based on what they think they're going to have available in terms of soil water or the timing of water applications, either through rainfall or through irrigation. So for example, a grower that has two soils, let's say one is a sandy soil that's going to have very little available soil water, they can pick an early maturity hybrid to get a low yielding but a crop off of that soil with the water that's available, or they can plant late if they need to with an early maturing hybrid, versus if they have another field with a heavier soil that's going to hold quite a bit more water, they can then go into, for example, a late maturity hybrid that is going to be able to draw water across the entire season from that heavier soil. And so that provides a lot of flexibility to be able to fine tune what sorghums are planted where according to the amount of water that's going to be available. So possibly what is maybe the most well-known sorghum drought adaptation trait is going to be stay green. Stay green is basically where after flowering, the plant delays its senescence or its death of leaf tissues. And so it maintains photosynthetically active leaf tissues for longer after flowering as the sorghum plant is accumulating photosynthetic substrate into its seed. It's essentially during the grain filling stage, and it leads to higher yields when there is post-anthesis or post-flowering drought stress. Now, this is actually quite a pretty complicated trait. It goes beyond just delaying the senescence of leaf tissues. It begins pre-anthesis by modifying the canopy architecture. So plants that have the stay green trait will have less leaf tissue pre-flowering, pre-anthesis. And that reduced amount of leaf tissue is going to lead to lower transpiration rates, or in other words, a lower consumption rate of soil available water. And so it essentially is shifting the timing of when photosynthetically active leaf tissue is available from early in the season to late in the season. And it also, by doing that, also shifts the timing of water. And so that water that would have been consumed by a very large leaf canopy early in the season instead gets shifted to the grain filling stage. That water has been saved, it's available, and now it has the leaf tissue to photosynthesize and fill the grain. And like I said, this is a quite complex trait, but I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to it. Something that's not a trait per se, but I think really is important for drought adaptation in sorghum, especially when compared to other crops that are being proposed for drought adaptation, is the fact that sorghum has decades of really good agronomic research and best practices that have been developed, especially for drought conditions. So for example, a grower, if they're starting growing sorghum from day one, are going to be able to have a lot of research to tell them how to adapt it, for example, to reduce tillage operations, if they want to use that method for saving soil water. Or for example, different planting arrangements to deal with reduced soil water availability. And so this is something that, for example, in other water-saving crops that maybe have not been planted for as long or as extensively as sorghum, still don't have. Really, agronomy is really important. It's estimated that since the 1960s, about 2/3 of the yield increase that has been seen in the United States in sorghum has come just from simply having better agronomic practices. So with regards to heat stress, sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice here. I'm getting over a cold. With regards to heat stress is in many ways, I think, a more complicated trait than drought stress. And that's because a lot of heat stress traits occur at the cellular and at the biochemical level. So they tend to be harder to phenotype. And so there's oftentimes less data available, and they're less well characterized versus drought tolerance traits. So these are traits, for example, cell membrane stability, enzyme activity at high temperatures, the efficiency of photosynthesis, traits that are quite hard to phenotype sometimes. But what I will say about sorghum and heat stress, I see that I'm starting to run out of time, is that sorghum is adapted to higher temperatures. So for example, if you look at the temperature range for growth in maize, it tends to top out at 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. Sorghum is adapted to slightly higher temperatures at 34 degrees Celsius or 93 degrees Fahrenheit. And sorghum yields begin to drop off at about 33 degrees Celsius versus 29 degrees Celsius in maize. One thing that I think a lot of people who have been growing sorghum have seen is that anthesis is the most sensitive stage to heat stress. But one thing that sorghum can do is it's able to delay panicle development, or in other words, delay flowering until that heat stress has passed. Sometimes this delay is just a few days, but it can go up to a few weeks in delay. Now, it can only do this up to a certain point. It will reach temperatures, for example, well, I'll show you in the next slide, where it doesn't matter. It's going to lose most of its yield. What I want to say here with this slide is that there is quite a bit of variability in different genotypes in terms of their ability to cope with heat stress. So I'm going to, again, minimize my yield and walk through this quickly because I can see the time clicking by. But for example, we have two different sorghum genotypes, Masia and Texas 430. And you can see in terms of the panicles that at 35 degrees Celsius, Masia is doing quite a bit better than Texas 430. But by the time you get to 40 degrees Celsius, neither one of these, you can't see this in this picture, but this is a blasted panicle. It has no seed on it. Both of these panicles have produced no seed. And so there is genotype variability in terms of their heat stress. Now, in terms of deploying these different traits to provide real-world adaptations to heat and drought stress, one of the places where this is already happening is replacing maize in traditional sorghum production. I'm sorry, in traditional maize production environments. So, for example, in Central America, there's already been there are already decreases in maize yield that are being seen, and they're forecasted to get even worse with climate change. And so, in Central America, there is already work being done to replace a lot of traditional foods. I know this is kind of lamentable. This is kind of sad. That are traditionally made with maize that are being now made with at least a portion of their ingredients being composed of sorghum. And this is probably going to become more important as the future progresses. So like I said, this is already happening. In many parts of Africa, sorghum has been replaced by maize, oftentimes for policy decisions. But this is another opportunity where increasing sorghum production, especially going into the future with climate change, has the opportunity to provide increased adaptation. I'm just really briefly going to walk you through this slide just because this is a measure of the decline in sorghum production in South Africa specifically. And in South Africa, I mentioned that policy decisions are oftentimes what has led maize to replace sorghum. Even though maize is very productive, maize is a fantastic crop. But for example, in South Africa, maize is tax exempt while sorghum is taxed. And so naturally, maize is going to be favored in many different applications. Another area where sorghum can provide an immediate benefit is in reducing aflatoxin risk. Just really briefly, aflatoxin, for those of y'all that don't know, it is a mycotoxin, or it's a family of mycotoxins that are produced by Aspergillus fungal species. They're very common in many different crops. You can find them in pistachios and corn. The sorghum does accumulate aflatoxins, wheat, many different agricultural products will accumulate aflatoxins. They are well-known carcinogens, they're mutagens, they have been tied to child stunting. And they can occur either in the field or in storage. And in the field, heat and drought stress will increase the susceptibility to the accumulation of aflatoxins. Sorghum accumulates less aflatoxin than maize for the reasons that you can see here in this slide. One thing I will mention is that the open panicle architecture of sorghum does provide an advantage versus a maize ear, which is covered in a husk and is going to provide sometimes a more conducive environment to the accumulation of aflatoxins. I want to highlight one study here that was published here in 2022, where maize, groundnut, or peanut, and sorghum were sampled as they came out of the field in 3 different countries in West Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and Niger, and they were measured for their aflatoxin content. Aflatoxin in countries, for example, in the United States, there are limits in how much aflatoxin a grain sample can have before it is prohibited for human or livestock consumption. For example, here in the United States, it's 20 micrograms per kilogram. The EU is more stringent at 4 micrograms per kilogram. But in many of these countries, there either are no limits or those limits are not enforced. And both acute exposure to aflatoxins and chronic exposure to aflatoxins are a problem. So just to highlight the results of one of their areas, this is from, I believe, in Mali. If you look at this environment in Kolikoro, maize samples are right here, sorghum samples are right here. The samples that are in green are considered safe to eat per the more stringent EU regulations. The samples that are in orange are acceptable per the more lax US standards. And if they're in red, they are uniformly considered not safe for human consumption. And so, for example, if you look at maize and sorghum, there's about a 20 to a 30% difference between the proportion of samples that are safe to eat per the EU standards coming from sorghum versus from maize. And at least for sorghum in this environment, all of the samples would be considered safe to eat for humans in this environment, while maize has about 25% of the samples which would be considered toxic for human consumption, but which more than likely do enter the food supply. And in this study, they tie this to increased rates of cancer and other health consequences. So this is my last slide, and just what I want to say, I'm not going to walk through everything that's on this slide here, is that sorghum has a lot of potential to provide heat and drought stress today, and it already is in many environments. But going forward, one thing I will want to mention is that there's data coming out showing that as climate change advances, that sorghum yields are likely going to decrease. In part, this is because sorghum is already in many environments operating at its limits for heat and drought stress. And so, for example, in this study that was published in 2017, at 2 degrees Celsius, there's already substantial yield losses occurring in sorghum, even for their most heat-resilient cultivars. And this is using existing US germplasm. And so it's going to take research, more plant breeding, more agronomy to be able to address this issue. To maintain sorghum production in environments, for example, like the Texas Panhandle, which are likely already at sorghum's limits for heat and drought stress. And so with that, I am going to conclude, and I really look forward to discussing these topics in more detail in a Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Juan and Daniel. Very interesting. I apologize. I had to leave, come back because of a technical problem. So I missed a few, or my chats got deleted. So I don't know if there were questions previously in the chats, but it's open for question and answer now to anyone who'd like to ask a question. Anybody have a hand up there?
Hey, Jonathan, I'll give a role to start with.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm on 2 things here. I'm on a phone in addition to being on screen. Sorry, there's a technical issue I couldn't resolve today. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting material, a lot of food for thought. Some of the presentations one could listen to again and get more out of. Among the questions I had, just from the beginning of my list, I won't go through all these, is a lot of talk about millet is about how resilient they are in the face of heat stress, which is a key consideration. Another environmental issue that we're running into a lot of places is a lot of moisture, excess rain, and so on. What my question is how sorghum and the millets researched in Juan DeSalvo's research, how they withstand waterlogging. Because I understand in West Africa, I know is back there that some years ago that whereas pearl millet did not like wet feet, as it were, sorghum could handle that pretty well. I don't know if that's a universal feature of sorghum or just of the varieties there. But yeah, both of you could speak a little bit to how they deal with wetter environments like we're having in the Midwest right now.
From my side, what I can say is that we are willing to test these varieties under drought, heat, and flooding conditions. We are working in some preliminary projects to do field testing with this. It's very complicated, but we have considered those traits, and we are interested in looking for it. So we will be taking that into consideration for the next trials.
With sorghum, I think it really depends on when that flooding is timed. You know, if it happens at the end of the season when grain is mature, you know, you're really at a risk for pre-harvest sprouting and for grain mold and other quality issues. And so there needs to be breeding specifically for resistance to those traits. I did mention, for example, Guinea sorghums in tropical West Africa generally tend to have more adaptation to those types of environments. So there may be in certain environments an opportunity for Guinea sorghums to play a role in breeding. In the United States, well, in countries with quite a bit of sorghum hybrids available, there's been a lot of discussion about having sorghum hybrids that can take advantage of that moisture when it's available. You know, there's oftentimes talk about defensive traits in sorghum, about sorghum being able to resist drought stress, but there are sorghum hybrids that also have offensive traits, offensive as in like in a sport playing offense, that can take that water and then increase the yield. And a lot of more modern sorghum hybrids have been developed with that in mind. I know that doesn't probably, can't be deployed right away in, for example, in Africa, you know, to have a sorghum genotype that has the defensive traits to be resistant to drought, but given abundant water availability can take that and then turn it into yield. There are genotypes that can do both, but that's would have to be implemented in Africa.
Thank you, Dr. Parker and Yuan, for your talk. We'll take questions from the audience. Claire Smith, please go ahead. Then we'll take from, yeah.
Thanks to both of you. I guess my question is for, I don't know if you know this or if you can answer this, but looking at, like, since they have been around for thousands and thousands of years, what are cultures using with, or like doing with the byproducts, specifically the hulls of the grain as well as the stalks? I know with sorghum, you can make sorghum molasses, but are there any other uses, like just thinking of using the whole plant as much as possible and upcycling or, you know, reducing waste? Are there other uses for, like, and buckwheat hulls? You can mill the buckwheat hulls, or I don't know, I'm just like trying to think of, if we get into processing millet, like what are we going to do with all these hulls? Can we make paper out of them? Like, you know, I'm just trying to think of something to do instead of, you know, putting it out in the field for compost, which is, you know, fine. But is there something else that other cultures have done with the byproducts?
Well, I don't know if you want to go first with millet, but I have a few thoughts on sorghum.
Yeah, no, I don't know really much about that. I know the residues can be foraged, but in specific about the hulling, I probably think that would be for feed for chickens or birds, but I wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not sure about other uses in millets.
In sorghum, I don't have very much background or experience with the traditional uses of sorghum outside of the United States. I do know that in some cultures it is fed to livestock. I would think, though, that in the United States it'd be a pretty low value livestock feed. So it might not be very economical to truck it, or unless if you had, a feedlot nearby or something along those lines, or maybe a poultry facility that needed bedding. So for example, in sorghum, leaving the stover on the field is really important for maintaining soil health. And so it does have a value in terms of having it going back onto the field. And so it could be of real value. And in sorghum, also, I mentioned that there are sorghums that accumulate sugar in the stem. Those are usually very specific types. They're not typically grain sorghums, although some grain sorghums can accumulate some sugar in the stem, but I think you'd have a hard time finding a hybrid on the market that combines the two traits.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take the question from Racine Lee.
Yes, thank you so much. Good evening. Evening for me. I'm in Senegal, West Africa. It's 9 p.m. here. I'm very interested into these discussions. Thank you for the presenters. And I heard about millet and sorghum and how they can be very interesting when it comes to adapting to climate-related shocks, for example, or to stress. But here in Senegal specifically, I'm hearing more and more about the possibility to rely on millet and sorghum as an alternative to wheat given the global context, right? So I was just thinking, in deciding to increase the production of millet or sorghum, one might also think about the nutritional aspects and to make sure that it's not going to increase or exacerbate the hidden hunger in rural areas that are specifically using a lot of millet and sorghum for a daily meal. So I was wondering what the presenters can tell us about the nutritional aspects related to sorghum and millet in general. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Racine, you mean nutritional in aspects for like as a food, or nutritional in aspect to soil nutrients? I didn't.
No, sorry, as a food.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so for finger millets, it's one of the highest calcium cereals that it's over there. So I know it's very important and it's very valuable. We also see that there's some high protein genotypes that are also very good, especially in places where those nutrients are lacking or people doesn't have access to food with those nutrients. So for specifically what we are looking here in Iowa would be to include, so talking about the food supply and that aspect, I think I forgot to mention in my presentation is we are looking for millets not as a summer crop only. We are thinking in doing a double crop with peas. So ideally, if we are here in Iowa and we try to replace corn or soybeans with only millets, there's probably no chance that we'll make it. So ideally, what we are thinking is on millet as a double cropping with peas or as a rescue crop when the summer crop fails. Here in the Midwest, we have a lot of extreme weather conditions, and sometimes we can lose a whole field of corn or soybeans, and then as finger millets grows very fast, we can plant millets and have at least one crop in that season that otherwise will be lost.
If I may jump in just very quickly here, in the June webinar, we're going to look directly specifically at nutrition. It's relevant to all of our discussions, all of them, of course, but we'll focus on that in June. So I hope you can. Right, go ahead.
Yeah, I think probably the June webinar probably has more information than I could provide regarding sorghum and nutrition. Like I mentioned, I worked primarily in biomass sorghums where seed was never a part of the harvested material. But I will say that there are food-specific sorghum hybrids and varieties out there, and by food-specific meant for human consumption, even though most sorghum production in the United States is for either ethanol or for livestock feed. And so those tend to be specialty sorghums, at least in the United States. There is a lot of diversity in these food sorghums in terms of nutritional quality. There has to be caution in selecting a sorghum for a human food product. Some of them will have anti-nutritional components, will have high tannins, which either have to be processed to be removed, or select a hybrid that's low tannin. So there's a lot of diversity there. So it would require experimentation to select the appropriate one. And I'm sure that somebody's from a seed company would be able to provide you a lot of information on that.
Thank you for that. We have a question from the chat for Yuan. In your study where you were looking at the consistency of the grain in size and diameter of different varieties, can you discuss about the cleaning and the dehulling process of these grains?
Yeah, so we didn't measure the size of the seed. We just did the weight. We counted 1,000 seeds and we weighed those. For finger millet, there's not a big issue with the hull because it's more like a seed coating. But for barnyard millet, what we had to do was the hull by hand. So far, we were not able to find any other way to dehull the seed. And so we had to do it by hand. And we actually did the 1,000 seeds that we needed to do the weight because it was very labor, although it was only 18 genotypes, it took some time. But yeah, we didn't take diameter or other parameters from the seed more than just the weight.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Parker, please go ahead.
I was going to mention that dehulling isn't really concerned in sorghum, it's free threshing. And so for grain sorghums, it should be okay. You may want to run it through a polisher if there's any kind of weathering, but other than that, it's not like buckwheat or some other crops.
Thank you so much for all the amazing questions and the answers. So we are 2 minutes from 5. So if anyone has some burning questions, please do ask or put it on chat. And touching on the threshing part, like, the dehulling part, that is a big limitation because the grain size is small, the clearance gap. So that's one place for more innovation and research to take place. So.
Yeah, I think I sent an email before to the sender list to have, if you have any ideas how we can do the dehulling in millets. For seed characterization, we need to remove the hull to have a better sense of the weight, the color of the seed. And yeah, if you have any feedback, any of you that it's working with millets or any other grain and you are dehulling, if you can send it some information, that would be very useful because everything that we have seen here, as Kiruba was saying, it's hard, or it breaks the seed or doesn't do anything to it. So, yeah.
So there's another question from Don. Is the barnyard millet in the Iowa State study, is it E. esculenta or E. fumarentaceae?
Yeah, so the whole collection, I think it's both of them. However, the ones that we selected, the 18 that we selected from those 200, I'm not sure, I need to go back and check specifically which are, but as they arrive as Echinocloa sp, it's a mix of 2 species. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all the questions.
Right.
Dr. Parker and Yuan, please, Jonathan, take ahead.
No, simply to thank him. We could go on for another 30 minutes, but we're slated for just an hour. And if anybody has follow-up questions, please ask any of us at the North American Millets Alliance. And also, this webinar will be available, a link to it via YouTube soon. So we hope to see you next month. I don't remember exactly the date, about the middle of the month, May 19th or 15th. We'll get back to you. But thank you all for being here, taking the time, especially our presenters, Juan and Daniel. Really terrific. everything you said just really leads to more questions, and maybe we'll have them addressed in the months to come. So thank you again. Have a good evening and see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.